The Year of the Black Pony by Walt Morey, Chapter 6. Sure enough, the first thing Ma asked when we rode in was, "What took so long?" "A little runaway," Mr. Chase said easily. "Bent a wheel on the rake. We'll have to take it to the blacksmith to be straightened." "Did you get thrown off or jump?" Ma asked me. "Lucky for him, he was off the rake when they spooked," Mr. Chase said. He nudged Jess in the ribs and went on into the barn. I followed. As we unharnessed and fed the horses, I said, "It looks like she believed you." "Why not?" he said. "I didn't lie. I just didn't quite tell all of it. But don't sell your Ma short. She is a smart woman." Ma didn't ask any more questions, but Ellie did. I'd like to have wrung her neck. "Why'd they run away, Daddy Frank?" Mr. Chase said, "Horses run away for 1,000 reasons, baby, and sometimes for no reason at all. But I'd guess a bee stung them. There's a lot of bees in the alfalfa this time of year." That satisfied Ellie, and no one spoke of it again. After supper, we mended the harnesses in the barn by lantern light. When we finally finished, Mr. Chase proclaimed them as good as ever. The main trouble had been the rivets that had pulled out. Early next morning, we left to repair the rake. Ma gave Mr. Chase a list of things she wanted from the store. At our old home place, we removed the bent teeth, and I held each one across a block while Mr. Chase hammered it into the proper shape again. It was almost noon when we finished that. We took off the bent wheel and the remaining bad teeth and headed for town. The blacksmith shop in Sunrise was one of the main social places for men to gather. There were always 2 or 3 lounging on the old buggy cushions placed for seats against the shop wall. The place smelled of smoke and horses and the hot blast of the forge. I loved to see the sparks fly, the flames leap, and the iron turn cherry red, and then watch as Hank Manning bent and shaped it with mighty blows from one of a dozen or more big hammers. There was only one old man sitting on a buggy seat that day. Spring and early summer were busy seasons. Ranchers had little time to sit and gossip when they came into town. Hank Manning, bare-armed and bare-chested, was putting a new tongue in a wagon. He came out and looked at our bent wheel and teeth. "I can fix these easy," he said. "It'll be an hour or so before I can get to 'em. You in a big rush?" "We've got part of a field left to rake." "You're in a rush. I've got to get this tongue in a wagon first, and it don't want to fit." Mr. Chase said, "I'll help if that'll speed things up." "It sure will." Frank Chase stripped off his coat and the 2 men went to work. I sat on one of the buggy seats to enjoy the smells and sounds and activity. They had the tongue bolted in place in less than an hour and pushed the wagon outside. Then they went to work on our wheel and the bent rake teeth. I wanted to stay and watch, but Mr. Chase handed me the grocery slip and said, "We can save some time if you'll go to the store and give this to Mr. Wright. I'll pick you up there as soon as we finish." I crossed the street to Wright's General Merchandise. Just before I entered, I saw Arlo and Oliver Grayson walk into the pastime. It was the first time I'd seen them since the hearing on Pa's death. I handed the list to Mr. Wright to fill out. He was an old man with snow-white hair. He always wore a spotlessly clean green apron that came down to his knees. I said, "If you can leave the stuff here on the counter, Mr. Chase will pick it up when he comes from the blacksmith shop." Mr. Wright nodded, adjusted his thick glasses, and squinted at the list, mumbling, "Flour, lamp chimney, salt, sugar, pepper, a gallon of coal oil. Fine, fine." While I waited for Mr. Chase, I wandered through the store, looking at a whole world of merchandise. Besides groceries, there were sections of bolts of cloth, shoes, hardware, harnesses, guns, clothing, even toys. I'd never had much time to wander through here and look at all the things before. Today, I enjoyed myself. I finally came to the gun rack, and there I stopped. A little single-shot .22 rifle caught my eye. It looked exactly like the big guns, only smaller. Mr. Wright came by and said, "See anything there you like?" "That .22, I said. "Nice little gun. For some reason, it don't sell. Guess the young fellas nowadays all want repeaters. Silly. It only takes 1 shot to bring down game. No sense spraying the landscape with lead. Expensive, too. Yes, sir, I said. A man and a woman came in, bought an armload of groceries, and left. A woman brought in a little boy, about 2 or 3. Mr. Wright spent a lot of time fitting him with shoes. A couple of ladies wandered in, came over to the bolts of cloth, and began looking them over. I was still admiring the little 22 when Mr. Chase pulled up out front and came inside. I went to meet him. Arlo and Oliver Grayson came through the door behind him. Mr. Chase went to the counter, looked over the stack of articles, took out his purse. Mr. Wright left the 2 women and came to the grocery section. Arlo leaned, half smiling, against a frame that held a great variety of handles. His colorless eyes watched Oliver. Oliver stopped a few feet behind Mr. Chase, spread his legs, and put his hands on his hips. The 2 weren't drunk, but they'd been drinking. I got a funny feeling in the pit of my stomach. Oliver said, "Well, well, the big man comes to town, Arlo. You know who this is? This is the big, brave man that killed Harry Fellows." "I know," Arlo kept smiling, "and Harry's so drunk he could hardly stand up." "You think maybe he could lick me, Arlo? I can stand up, see?" Mr. Chase glanced around and was aware of them for the first time. He turned back to Mr. Wright and counted out the money for our supplies. Oliver went on talking. "You think maybe he can lick me, Arlo, a man as can stand on 2 legs and fight back?" "Never in this world," Arlo grinned. Mr. Chase tossed the sack of flour to his shoulder and said to me, "You bring the rest, boy," and started towards the door. Oliver blocked his path. Mr. Chase stopped and said very quietly, "All right, boys, you've had your fun." "Not quite, we ain't," Oliver said. Mr. Wright said in a frightened voice, "Now, boys, now, I don't want any trouble in here. Take your quarrel outside." I had stopped by a case of pocket knives, too surprised and scared to move. Arlo said to Mr. Wright, "Shut up, old man." He stepped to the counter, leaned forward, and slammed his fist into Mr. Wright's chest. The storekeeper stumbled back and fell against the shelves. The 2 women who'd been edging toward the door bolted outside. Oliver said to Mr. Chase, "You've had this coming for months, and now you're going to get it." He hauled back his fist and hit Mr. Chase flush on the chin. Mr. Chase stumbled back, lost his hold on the flour, and it fell to the floor. The sack burst open and the flour spilled out. Then Oliver went after Mr. Chase, swinging both fists. "This is for Harry," he shouted. Frank Chase began backing away. He had both hands up, warding off the flying fists. He didn't try to hit Oliver. He kept saying, "All right, Oliver, all right. Just cool down. Cool down. Don't be a fool, man. I'm not looking for trouble with you." Mr. Wright came up from behind the counter, ran the length of it, and scuttled out the door. He raced up the street, his green apron flying. Arlo began chanting, "Give it to him, Oliver. Sock him again. Show him how it is to fight a real man." Oliver landed a hard punch alongside Mr. Chase's head, staggering him. Arlo yelled gleefully, "That's a boy. That's showing him. Bust him again." Mr. Chase kept backing away, trying to avoid the punches. He did avoid some, but many landed. Oliver hit him in the chin and staggered him again. A punch grazed his cheek, drawing an angry red trail that began to ooze blood, and still he hadn't yet punched back. He kept sliding away, trying to talk to Oliver. He backed completely around the rack that held the handles, and I could see he was headed towards the door to get outside. Oliver saw what he was doing, ran around the rack, and cut him off. He threw another wild punch. I guess Mr. Chase saw then that there was no use trying to reason further. That big right fist shot out, and Oliver stopped as if he'd hit a wall. A second punch smashed him between the eyes, and he fell over backwards. That's when Arlo took a hand. He ran in behind Mr. Chase, hit him on the back of the neck, and knocked him down. Oliver jumped up, and they both began kicking Mr. Chase. But for a big man, he was surprisingly quick. He rolled out of the way of the flying feet and came up. Arlo grabbed him and pinned his arms to his sides. Oliver planted his feet and began smashing Mr. Chase in the face with both fists. That was more than I could stand. Without even thinking, I ran up behind Arlo, jumped on him, and grabbed both hands full of long blonde hair. I began to yank. His head snapped back and forth, but I couldn't make him let go. His ear was right close to my mouth, and the temptation was too great. I leaned forward, got a mouthful of air, and clamped down hard as I could. Arlo squalled like a scalded cat. He tried to shake me loose, but I had an awful good hold on his hair. Then he tried to twist his head and jerk his ear out of my teeth, but I had a mighty good bite. He let go of Mr. Chase with one arm, punched back over his shoulder, and hit me in the face. But I hung on. He hit me a second time and a third. Then I lost my bite and fell off. He whirled and smashed me in the mouth. I sailed backward into the rack of handles, knocked the rack over, and sprawled among the handles. Mr. Chase spun around, hit Arlo on the chin, and turned back to face Oliver. Arlo stumbled backward, lost his balance, and fell beside me. He started to crawl out of the mess of rolling handles on all fours. I picked up the first handle handy. To this day, I couldn't tell you what kind it was, but I brought it down on Arlo's head with both hands as hard as I could swing. The handle broke. But it sure took Arlo out of the fight. He went flat on his face and didn't move again. I sat there holding the stub of the handle. If he tried to get up, I was going to whack him again. I watched Mr. Chase wade into Oliver Grayson. Oliver could fight all right. He was about the same height as Mr. Chase, but his fists weren't as big and hard, and his shoulders weren't as broad. Mr. Chase was mad. Those black brows were pulled down in an ugly scowl, and I could barely see his eyes. In about a minute, Oliver learned he was in bad trouble. He started backing away, trying to defend himself. I saw then what those big shoulders could do. Every time Mr. Chase hit Oliver, it hurt him, and he was hitting him a lot. Mr. Chase finally knocked Oliver sprawling, and he tried to crawl toward the front door to get away. Mr. Chase grabbed his legs, hauled him back, lifted him to his feet, and knocked him down again. Oliver grabbed a handle. Mr. Chase jumped on that hand with his heel and ground it until Oliver yelled and dropped the handle. Then he yanked Oliver up again, held him at arm's length with one hand, deliberately cocked his right fist, measured Oliver, and swung. It sounded like a butcher dropping a side of beef on a meat block. Oliver folded up, flat on his face. Then Sheriff Peck came through the door, followed by Mr. Wright. Arlo was beginning to stir and groan. Sheriff Peck hauled him out of the mess of handles and propped him up against the counter. He rolled Oliver over, slapped his face hard a couple times, and dragged him to Arlo. He clamped handcuffs on both of them. Mr. Chase lifted me up and asked, "You all right, boy?" He got out a handkerchief and began wiping my mouth. There was blood on the handkerchief. I tasted it in my mouth. Mr. Chase was panting, and there was blood on his face from half a dozen cuts and bruises. "I'm all right," I said. "How about you?" "I think we'll both live," he smiled. Sheriff Peck asked, "Son, how'd you get mixed up in this ruckus?" "He came to my rescue," Mr. Chase said. "I was in real trouble when he took on Arlo." "Kind of overmatched yourself, didn't you, son?" the sheriff asked. "I guess so," I said. "He might have been overmatched a little," Mr. Chase said, "but he took Arlo out of that fight permanently." "Is that a fact?" The sheriff looked me over. "You're quite a tiger." Then we all just stood there and looked around. The grocery section of the store was a mess. Mr. Chase, Oliver, and Arlo had stomped through the spilled flour and scattered it over everything like dust. Handles were everywhere. The flame that held them was smashed flat. A gunny sack of peanuts had been spilled. A couple of cases of canned goods had broken open, and peaches and tomato cans had rolled in all directions. Mr. Chase shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wright." Mr. Wright said, "Not your fault, Frank. You done your best to avoid this fight. I saw what happened. Nobody could have done more than you did." "I've been watching those two for a couple of hours," Sheriff Peck said, "just waiting for the right time to move in and order 'em out of town. I could see trouble brewing. Guess I waited a little too long. They're going to pay for this, Mr. Wright, down to the last grain of flour." Oliver and Arlo were beginning to stir and sit up. The sheriff leaned over them and said, "You hear that, both of you? You're going to pay for this whole mess. If you have to sell every cow on your place and the place too. And you're going to go to jail on top of it. Then if I ever catch you in town again, I'll toss you both in jail on sight." He hauled them to their feet and shoved them out the door. They looked pretty beat up. Arlo had a knot on his head big as an egg where the handle had cracked him, and his ear kept dripping blood. Oliver's face was a mess. One eye was closing, his nose was knocked to one side and bleeding, and his mouth was puffed up like a balloon. Mr. Wright got us another sack of flour. Then Mr. Chase and I helped him gather up all the handles, the canned food, the peanuts, and we carried the broken handle rack outside. Then we took our stuff, got into the wagon, and drove out of town. My mouth was on fire. It kept bleeding and swelling. I discovered I also had a small gash alongside my right eye. It kept oozing blood. Mr. Chase dabbed at his own numerous cuts. 2 buttons on his shirt were gone, and the right sleeve was torn half off. I was surprised his face didn't look worse, considering the many times Oliver hit him. I felt pretty shaky, and I noticed that Mr. Chase kept drawing deep breaths. We came to the creek about a mile out of town, and Mr. Chase pulled off the road. "We better wash up a little before we go home," he said. "Your face don't look too good. One glimpse of you like this might scare your ma half to death." I said, "You don't look so good either." "I don't feel so good." He smiled a little and winced. "I'm surprised I've got a face left. Oliver gave me some pretty good shots. It'd have been a lot worse if you hadn't walloped Arlo over the noggin with that handle. How come you declared yourself into that fight?" "It was so unfair, both of them jumping on you." "It was that, all right. I'd have never made it without your help. If I didn't thank you before, I do now. It was a nervy thing for a boy to do." "All right, what say we wash up?" The cold water felt mighty good. We sat on rocks side by side, washed our faces, and dabbed at cuts and bruises with soaked handkerchiefs. Mr. Chase finally looked me over and said, "You missed a couple of spots." He cleaned them up with his handkerchief. "There, you look some better, but not a whole lot. There's no doubt you've been in a slugfest. You ever had a black eye?" "No," I said. "You're going to now. How do I look?" "Not so good. You missed quite a few." He sat still while I washed up his cuts. There were a couple of pretty bad ones. "That's the best I can do," I said finally. "You look like a mowing machine ran over you." "I feel like it." Then we just sat there saying nothing. I could feel the excitement of the fight draining out of me, even as it must have been from him. A kingfisher lit on a limb nearby and studied the water, then flew away. A faint breeze stirred the leaves. Mr. Chase looked up and smiled. The barrier between us was gone, along with that small nagging fear. I was proud that I'd sided with him in the fight. He asked, "You mind being called Chris? Your ma always says Christopher." "I like Chris better, especially better than boy." "Good. I don't like Mr. Chase. Frank suits me fine." "Me too," I said. He wrung out his handkerchief in the creek and stood up. "I doubt your ma would have called this fight a practical thing. I figure she don't hold much with fighting. Ladies mostly don't. You suppose she'll romp on us pretty hard?" "A little, maybe," I said. "She didn't like Pa fighting, but she couldn't stop him. He had a temper." "Mighty fine woman, your ma," he observed. "Mighty fine, but she don't give an inch. Not a blessed inch." "Pa always said she had a ramrod up her back," I said. "That she has. Well, let's get these gladiators home. You know, the beating we get there may be worse than what Arlo and Oliver gave us."